Welcome to Small Pleasures, the podcast that discusses great short stories and greatness in the short story form. My name is Livy Michael, and I'm a novelist and short story writer from Manchester, England. And this is Sonia Moore, a short story writer and translator from Paris, France.
Bienvenue.
We've come together because of a mutual enthusiasm for the short story, although I think our responses to and what we want from a short story vary, and we hope that the differences will provide a fruitful discussion. Today, we're delighted that Nicholas Royle has agreed to be interviewed for a special episode.
Nicholas Royle is a novelist, editor, publisher, literary reviewer, translator, and creative writing teacher and mentor. He's written over 100 short stories, 7 novels, 2 works of non-fiction, Shadow Lines and White Spines, which are brilliant works about book collecting and second-hand bookshops. Nicholas Royle judged the Manchester Fiction Prize for short fiction for many years. He's also the editor of several novels, including The Lighthouse by Alison and The Many by Menmuir, both of which were listed for the Booker Prize. He has edited more than 24 short story collections, including the yearly anthology The Best British Short Stories, with the renowned Salt Publishing. He runs Nightjar Press, which publishes beautifully produced limited edition chapbooks, each containing a single story. And I understand that you have a mini collection upcoming, The Building Inspector by Myriam Frey. Nicholas Royle has crafted the first English translation of Vincent de Swarte's novel Pharricide and has himself produced 6 collections of short stories. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much, Sonia and Livy. It's great to be here.
So that's an impressive involvement with fiction in general and the short form in particular. In this interview, we want to talk about your short stories, of course, since you're about to have a new collection out, but also your comprehensive engagement with the short form and the different roles you play with regard to it. Editor, mentor, teacher, writer, publisher, agent, and judge. So I'd like to begin by asking you, how did your interest in short fiction come about? Was it there from the start of your writing career, or has it gradually increased?
I think my interest in short fiction started before my writing career began, so it started as a reader. One of my greatest enthusiasms as a reader in my, I don't know, maybe teenage years or late teenage years and early 20s were horror stories, and in particular, the Pan Book of Horror Stories, a series that ran to 30 volumes. And the Fontana did a similar series, 2 similar series, one of horror stories, one of ghost stories. And I loved these both for the stories that they contained. Obviously, some were better than others, and that's the nature of anthologies, or some appealed more to me than others. But also, I liked the series themselves. I liked the fact that they were collectible. I've always been drawn to things that are in series or that are the same but different. So the seventh Pan Book of Horror Stories or the 24th Pan Book of Horror Stories, they're connected, but they're different. They have different contents, they have different covers, but they're part of something that's coherent. And my first professional sale as a writer was to the Pan Book of Horror Stories, and it was a story that appeared in the 26th Pan Book of Horror Stories, which came out when I was living in Paris for a year. That was in 1985, 84 or 85, and it was incredibly exciting for me. I went to W.H. Smith on the Rue de Rivoli, and they had a copy in, and I can remember the excitement, the thrill, the physical sensation that you felt on the skin seeing this book with my story in it. Before that, there'd been a story in a magazine, but I wasn't paid anything for that. But both of those appearances were incredibly exciting.
Wonderful. I mean, obviously, your interest is going to begin with reading the short story, and then your other roles kind of evolve from that. Which of the many roles that you're now involved in is the most demanding, would you say?
I think it might be doing Nightjar Press, which, as Sonia said, is all about publishing individual short stories in the form of chapbooks. It takes up an awful lot of time and effort and money, but I love doing it. I've been doing it since 2009, and the highs that you get from it are very powerful. But it seems to take up increasing amounts of time in terms of the reading of submissions. I get a lot of submissions and I read them all. one really appreciates these submissions that come in from writers who have taken the trouble to familiarize themselves with what Nightjar publishes. And you can tell that they've done that either because you simply recognize their name from their having placed an order. You've sent them something, and so you know that they've bought something, and that's great. They bought it, they've read it. That way, they acquire an idea of what the publisher does. But unfortunately, those people are in the minority, and the vast majority don't really have very much sense of what Nightjar does, or no more idea than they've been able to pick up from, say, reading a short description on the Nightjar website about what it is that we publish. And so I get a lot of submissions with email pitches that say, well, I think my story is a very good fit for Nightjar. I mean, really, it's not for them to say. So I would advise people, I mean, the best advice for people submitting work to publishers is to have demonstrated that they know what the publishers
I
like.
mean, I think that's always the case. I once read that the vast majority of rejections that writers get are because they haven't really engaged with what the particular press publishes. So it's not just yours. But
Yeah,
I'm always interested in how writers juggle the many roles that they play in life with their own writing.
yeah,
And you're hinting that really the main impact is on time.
yes,
I mean,
yes.
anything else? Does it help or get in the way that you read so many other writers?
Well, I mean, it can be inspiring and it can be exciting because every now and then, out of all the stories that are submitted, you read something and you get that sense of excitement, that real excitement that you get from reading something that you think might be suitable and that you think is outstanding and exceptional in some way. And you read it with a sort of mounting excitement, plus at the same time running alongside a kind of anxiety because you want the author not to mess it up. You want it to be good. You want to end up with more questions than answers. That's my personal response to short stories. I want to end up with more questions than answers. I want there to be a sense of ambiguity. I want it to knock me out in a way. While reading the story, you're feeling all of this, all these slightly different feelings and responses at the same time. And it's great when everything comes together. And when I say that comes together, I don't mean is neatly tied up, but when it's the right kind of experience and when it feels like the right kind of story, it's great to be able to write back to someone and say that you really liked it and it's definitely the kind of thing that we're looking for. What I often say in terms of rejecting stories is that it doesn't quite feel like a Nightjar story. And somebody wrote back to me once and said, well, what makes you think I was trying to write one? Made me think, because I think he went on to say something like, if you only ever published the same kind of story all the time, it'd be a very boring press, wouldn't it? I don't think I do publish the same kind of thing all the time. I think what I publish is allowed to evolve, but I won't be badgered into publishing someone's story simply because they think it's a good fit.
I
I
love
think I
hearing
went
about
off
your
topic there slightly. I'm sorry, Sonia, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely on topic. I love hearing about your responses as a reader. I feel the excitement.
Yes.
On the topic of roles, one of the things I greatly admire about you as a writer, educator, and editor, as a human being generally, is your
Oh,
ethics. I believe you work with a self-imposed segregation of duties, separating editing and publishing from writing. And while you seem to have an enviable flair for promotion, you're careful not to take up more space than collaborators when involved in joint projects.
mhm.
Would you feel comfortable talking about ethical boundaries in short fiction or ethical aspirations for writers?
Yes, I was mortified recently when I included in a volume of Best British Short Stories, which a series that I edit for Salt Publishing, I included a story by the other Nicholas Royle. Three people, when that volume came out, three people, intelligent, well-read, perceptive people, wrote to me and said, oh, I really liked your story that you included in Best British Short Stories this time. Obviously, I wrote back to them and said, well, it wasn't mine. It was by the person that I call the other Nicholas Royle. He
It was
obviously calls,
brilliant, I have to say.
I mean, he probably calls me the other Nicholas Royle. Why wouldn't he? I would if I were him. But I'm not him, and it wasn't my story, it was his story. And he had his author biographical note in the book, and I had my biographical note as the editor, And if you read them both, they're completely different, and you can see that we're two different people. I never quite like to say we share the name, although some people put it in those terms, because that makes it seem like one name that we're sharing, and I get it for a bit and then he has it back, and like, I don't know, or sharing a flat or something. Yes, it's the same name, but we each have it. And of course, we each have different middle names, and either of us could, if we had wanted to, we could have used those middle names to help people distinguish between us. And I suppose it's our own lookout that we didn't. And so there is a great deal of confusion between the two of us. But I was mortified, as I say, that some people thought that I was including a story by me in a book titled by me, Best British Short Stories. That I was saying one of my stories that I published last year was one of the best short stories published last year. I mean, I would never do that. Well, it just seems obvious to me, and so I was very surprised that some people thought it was me. But the name is a powerful thing. You see that name and you think it corresponds to your concept of what that name means. And usually that means you're thinking of a particular individual. But in the case of me and the other Nicholas Royle, some people will be thinking of me and some people will be thinking of him. Or they're thinking of some fictitious character that in their mind exists and wrote all of those books, some of which are by me and some of which are by him. But I've always taken quite a strong line on editors. I think there's a difference between including your work in something and making a big deal about including your work, or giving yourself better billing or higher billing than other contributors. There's one particular writer and editor who put a story of his in an anthology that had some kind of description on the front that was like, oh, these are among the best of stories in this genre published in recent years, something like that. And I just don't think you can do that or should do that if you're the editor of that book. Which is not to say that I stand in judgment over people. Well, I suppose I was just doing so. But I don't want to appear to be overly judgmental. And for myself, I do like to try to keep those roles different. But at the same time, I have occasionally published stories of mine in anthologies that I've edited, but I've done it by creating another persona, a pseudonym. And I think there's something slightly different there, because I think there's a sort of literary mischievousness, a certain playfulness. And perhaps it's a creative act, I think, creating a persona, a pseudonym, because it's attached to a writer who writes slightly different kinds of stories from the kinds of stories that I normally write.
But actually, I think one of the points Sonia's making is that you just spend a large amount of time promoting other writers. That is
I,
probably the greater part of what you do, really, isn't it?
I do that, and I suppose I do it because I enjoy it and because I love to. I don't know. I suppose if I have any kind of privileged position that allows me to give other people a leg up, as it were, then I enjoy making the most of that. And
Well, I
partly
think
I
your work
really,
is a testament to that, really, all of it. And I'd like to go back just a little bit to Nightjar Press and that point you made about how the stories are not all the same. There's
yeah.
considerable variety, and yet there is a very distinctive brand, I think, that is
Mm.
Nightjar Press. And I wondered if you would talk about that and a little bit about what you're looking for the benefit of those listeners who haven't yet come across it.
Sure. I'm very interested in the uncanny and in uncanny effects in stories. And there are all sorts of other words that one could use. What you could describe them as horror stories, macabre stories, weird fiction.
I think they're not horror stories in the strictest sense. I
Okay,
think
well, that's
uncanny is a
interesting.
better word for it.
Yeah,
Considering that you say you started off with this interest in horror,
yeah.
I
I mean,
think
I
very
did.
few of them are full on horror,
Yeah,
actually.
that's true. That's true. Some of them perhaps are. It's difficult. There's a writer called Robert Aikman, who, the late Robert Aikman, I'm a huge admirer of his work. He described his stories as strange stories. And it's just, I mean, it fits. It happens to fit his work. It's a good word for them. If one uses the term horror, you immediately exclude a certain number of readers who think, oh, I don't like horror. Or if you call them all Gothic stories, certain other assumptions are made. So maybe
Hmm.
uncanny is a good catch-all term. One thing that I have become interested in is the sort of a grey area that I think exists between experimental fiction and horror stories or uncanny literature. And I've become very interested in trying to find out if it's possible to create uncanny effects using an experimental approach. So there've been some stories that we have published that will have seemed to some readers like they don't really fit because they're not obviously uncanny. They're not ghost stories, for example. Ghost stories is another term that a lot of people use for this kind of work. I'm so literal minded that if I hear or read the term ghost story, then I'm expecting a ghost in the story. And if there isn't
Me
one, then I
too.
think, well,
Yeah.
in what sense was that a ghost story? But a lot of people will use that term as a sort of catch-all term.
You mentioned doubles, Nick. I see that that's quite a constant fascination since some of the first stories of yours that I read, which were collected in Mortality, published
Yeah.
in 2006 by Serpent's Tale. There are other fairly constant motifs that perhaps respond to what you were saying about strange stories. There's often somebody who's seeking somebody else based on a scrap of documentation, like in Flying into Naples from Mortality or Photo Booth from Paris Fantastique. There's a mise en abîme as well, and surreal
Mhm.
interruptions in daily life, like in La Gare and The Rainbow. Could you talk a little more about how your relationship to these fascinations has changed over time? You touched on that a little bit in talking about experimentation.
Yes, I think I've become more drawn to experimental writing as both a reader and as a writer. So these last three collections, London Gothic, Manchester Uncanny, and Paris Fantastique, they all contain two or three more experimental stories. In those stories, I'm trying to use an experimental approach to create uncanny effects, but very often my stories come from something that I've seen or an idea that hits me one day, usually based on something that I've seen or something that's happened to me. You mentioned Flying into Naples. That story came quite directly from a visit that I made to Naples to try and track down an acquaintance who I thought had invited me to Naples. And when I turned up in Naples, it turned out she hadn't. And this just led directly to the rest of the story. And Photo Booth, which you mentioned, which is in Paris Fantastique, came almost as one as an idea when I was walking through the Parc des Buttes-Chaumont in Paris and saw one of those photo booths in the middle of the park. It seemed to me like a surreal moment, and I'm using the word carefully, i.e., not just to mean unusual. Who would expect to see a photo booth in a park? And yet there it was. And so I thought, well, what's different about this photo booth? And so the idea came to me that it's a photo booth that takes years off you. You have your photograph taken and you look 10, 15, 20 years younger. And then I started thinking, well, why would that be an interesting thing? You know, where's the story in that? And similarly with the rainbow, I just thought one day, what if there was a rainbow that didn't go away? And what might that mean?
I mean, just to pick up on what you're saying about Photo Booth, I found it quite an emotional story, and your characters rarely express emotion directly, yet your stories are often very poignant, as in Photo Booth, music for French films, and especially Beethoven, which actually made me want to cry. It seems to me that the stories often arise out of this displacement of emotion.
Mhm.
Also, at the same time, in terms of how you're changing as a writer, I found these stories more emotional than your earlier collections. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, I think I've become more and more drawn to writing about universal difficulties such as loss and grief well, I think I've been writing about, say, the fear of mortality or the acceptance of mortality. I suppose those are two different things. In fact, two diametrically opposed things, the fear of and acceptance of mortality. I think I've probably been writing about that for a long time. I mean, witness the title of the 2006 collection, Mortality. But yes, I think there is an avoidance, perhaps. I don't know if it's deliberate. I don't want to write the character, you know, whatever the character's called. Let's say the character's called Sarah. I don't want to write Sarah was sad or Sarah felt tears well up or whatever. It's too obvious somehow. It's too much like telling rather than allowing the reader to see and work things out. So I always want there to be less rather than more. I always want the reader to have to be doing some work to work out what's really going on, what it is that I'm really writing about.
I'd be interested to know more about the how of your crafting and whether that's changed over time. In your interview for the European Network for Short Fiction Research, you mentioned a particular train seat as your writing space.
Mhm.
And Ailsa Cox and David Rose have also talked about writing in between time spaces, such as cafes during lunch hour or downtime in overly long work meetings. Is there a connection between short fiction and writing in the interstices of life?
Yes, but then maybe it's not just short fiction. Maybe writing generally is something that I do in the interstices of life, and or maybe it's as prosaic as thinking that I need to make the best use of the 2 hours that I regularly spend on a train between Manchester and London, and the fact that I'm unlikely to be interrupted. There are fewer distractions than usual. I'm sitting in relative comfort. It's a good opportunity to get some work done. And so I do tend, and I am a creature of habit increasingly. And so if seat 48A in carriage A is available, then I will be sitting there and I'll be working. Some years ago, they reserved that seat and the one next to it for cyclists. And I still like to sit in those seats, but then there's the very slight anxiety that one feels that two cyclists or one cyclist might get on and say, "Hey, you're sitting in my seat," in which case I'll move. But I do like those seats. I've become used to them, and that's where I feel I do my best work. As I say, it's a routine, and I'm used to it, and it works for me. There are certain cafes as well, so I feel a terrible sense of personal betrayal, or I did, when a cafe local to me in Manchester that I went to every day and would work there between, say, 5 and 6, and then have a drink, when it changed hands, when the owners sold it. And it's still there, but it's different, and they don't have Belgian beers anymore. So I can sit there and work, but it's not the same. It doesn't feel right.
I was just noticing as you were talking then, Nick, how you're always very slightly ironic about yourself. And that irony and that humour permeates the short stories. As Sonia was saying, sometimes Paris Fantastique made you laugh, didn't it, Sonia?
I
We
found
were
it very
picking up on
funny,
that.
yes.
Good, good.
So it's very funny as well as this kind of poignant sense in the stories. Does this kind of humour arise naturally for you when you're working, or how much rewriting of humour do you do?
I think it does arise naturally. And I suppose I like it when the material is either very dark or quite poignant. It's good as a contrast. And maybe when I was younger, I didn't fully appreciate that you can have these contrasts. Maybe it was a bit more all one note when I was younger. And I thought, oh, it's got to be very dark and doomy and serious in order to make the points that I want to make. Whereas now I suppose I think that I can allow my ironic, what's the word, self-deprecation. Maybe I can allow that to inflect my style a bit more now. So often when I'm putting jokes in, they're not gags as such, but maybe it's more me allowing in a little bit of my personality. Maybe, I don't know.
So I think that's another way in which your writing is evolving. I
Yeah.
think that may be all we have time for now, but just to say that several of your collections are published by Confingo now, which is a very excellent press in Manchester, do very beautifully produced work. But other than that, I want to say thank you so much, Nick, for talking to us today. And we're really looking forward to the release of the collection, Paris Fantastique, which is due out from Confingo in November 2025. And do look up Nick's other collections, London Gothic, Manchester Uncanny, Ornithology, which are all from Confingo, Mortality from Serpent's Tail, and The Dummy and Other Uncanny Stories from the Swan River Press, because they're all excellent reads. You've been listening to Nicholas Royle, editor, publisher, and teacher of short fiction, translator, and above all, writer extraordinaire, especially in the short form. Once again, thank you for listening to this Small Pleasures podcast, and do keep your eyes and ears open for our next. Watch this space, we have many great short stories to cover. Until then, goodbye from me, Livy Michael, and from Sonia Moore.
À très bientôt.
And from Nicholas Royle.
Thank you very much for having me, Livy and Sonia, and thank you for listening.